Hi and welcome to another episode of Essop's E-Lessons. Today we'll be looking at Felix Randal by Gerard Manley Hopkins. If you find these videos helpful, please hit like, subscribe and don't forget to share. So let's start with the title. If you've read the poem, it's about a man who's passed away and it's basically kind of a eulogy for this deceased man. The poet was actually the minister to Felix Randal. This poem is about his deep sense of compassion in his connection with a dying man. It is important to know that this poem was written in England in 1885, as this does affect the language that is used. You'll see some of the pronouns are from older English. Okay, so this poem is structured as a Petrarchan sonnet, so I'll be analyzing the octave and then the sestet. So let's look at the first 4 lines of the octave. Okay, the first line says, Felix Randal the farrier, oh is he dead then? So farrier means a blacksmith, right? A blacksmith, specifically one who shoes horses. We see the question mark indicates shock. The speaker is quite surprised to hear of his death. His response is then, my duty all ended. So we know that he was the priest who cared for this dying man. Line 2 goes on to say, who have watched his mold of man. Mold of man here is a metaphor. We see that Felix Randal is compared to a metal that is molded into a certain shape. Because blacksmiths work with metal, they heat it, they mold it, they make it stronger. And so this comparison suggests that he was a very strong man. Okay, we see the description of Felix Randal continue. It says big boned and hardy, handsome. And this description contains a lot of alliteration, and these hard consonant sounds, repetition of B and repetition of H, they reinforce this idea of physical strength. Okay, so he watched Felix Randal, this big man, pining. The word pining here tells us that he suffered from either mental or physical decline, perhaps both. And the repetition of the word pining emphasizes how he lost his physical strength and rational mind over time. We see line 3 goes on to say, till time when reason rambled in it. Reason ramble suggests that he loses touch with his rational mind. In some fatal 4 disorders, fleshed there, that talks about his body declining. We also see alliteration with the pining and fatal 4 fleshed. The repetition of these sounds here suggests suffering and pain. We see the repetition of the R sound echoes a delirium of illness and perhaps even difficulty breathing. So in line 4, when he says the fatal 4 disorders, so remember that this was written in the 1800s in England, and they didn't have a very good understanding of the human body as we do now. So their theory as to the human body was that there were 4 fatal disorders, or rather that there were 4 liquids within the human body, and if these liquids were out of balance, then that made you ill. So the 4 liquids that they thought were important were black bile, which was sometimes called melancholy, so too much of that would make you extremely depressed, yellow bile, blood and phlegm. So all of these were thought to be needed by the body, but there had to be a balance. When he says the fatal 4 disorders fleshed, they all contended. Contended means the struggle has come to an end. So it means that he's lost this battle against these 4 fatal disorders. And we see line 4 actually ends with a question mark, and this is a rhetorical question. It's basically our speaker reflecting on the long illness that led to Randal's death. We continue with the octave. Remember, our octave is 8 lines long. So let's move on to line 5. It says sickness broke him. So this here is a metaphor. We see Randal is compared to an object that can be broken. The fact that sickness broke him suggests that his illness destroyed his body. Right, he goes on to describe how Randal reacted. He says, impatient, he cursed at first. So we know that he was angered by his diagnosis, but he mended, being anointed and all. So mended suggests healing. So not a physical healing, but more of a religious healing, as the word anointed suggests. Okay, so he found comfort in his faith. So a heavenlier heart began some months earlier. So we know that despite the decline of his body, he became more virtuous, more religious, and this is where he found his comfort despite his illness. So a heavenlier heart began some months earlier, since I had our sweet reprieve. So the sweet reprieve means a relief from evil, and we see that the speaker is actually referring to him counseling Randal, being the minister to Randal. Our sweet reprieve and a ransom tended to him. So the ransom here, it's almost as though he bought his soul back and tended to him. So we know that the speaker, Hopkins, helped to provide him counsel. If we look at the words broke and mended, It highlights Randal's physical health, which declined, but also the fact that his spiritual health blossomed despite his body giving up on him. In line 80, it ends with, "Ah well, God rest him all road he ever offended." So the "ah well" shows acceptance. As much as our speaker was shocked when he initially heard of Randal's death, he now comes to accept it. And he says, "God rest him all road he ever offended." So basically saying, may he be forgiven for all his sins. Remember that a Petrarchan sonnet has a volta after the octave, so there's a change in subject matter. So the octave was very dispassionate, detached, telling us matter-of-factly that Felix Randal was ill, he physically declined, even though spiritually he got better. The sestep we will see shows a change in subject matter. This seeing the sick endear them to us to it endears. So the term endears means to make loved. So basically it means caring for the sick make us love them, but it also makes the sick people appreciate those who care for them. So there's a reciprocal relationship between Felix Randal and our speaker. He says, "My tongue had taught thee comfort, touch had quenched thy tears." So remember I said it is Old English, so thee means you, thy means your. And so when he says, "My tongue had taught thee comfort," this is an example of synecdoche. Synecdoche is when a part represents a whole. So here, the speaker's tongue represents himself. As much as he says, "My tongue taught thee comfort," he's basically saying, "I comforted you." He goes on to say, "Touch had quenched thy tears." So quenched here means to suppress or to stop. So he's telling you that he physically comforted Randal through difficult times. He stopped him from crying. And then he goes on in line 11 to say, "My tears that touched my heart." So even though this was a very emotional experience for Randal, we see that it was quite emotional for the speaker as well. And through this personification, where the speaker's tears are given the ability to touch his heart, it suggests that the speaker was deeply affected by his relationship with Randal. Right? He goes on to describe him as child, which suggests a paternal love. And he says, "Felix, poor Felix Randal," and this repetition emphasizes his sense of loss. As the sestep continues, he says, "How far from then forethought." So basically saying how far from one's mind, "all thy more boisterous years." So at the end of Randal's illness, he found it really hard to remember how full of life Randal was. Right? So he's remembering now how Randal looked in his younger years, when thou at the random grim forge. So when you were at a furnace, powerful amidst spears. So he's telling you that when Randal was doing his job, he was stronger and better than any other blacksmith. "Didst fettle for the great grey dray horse his bright and battering sandal." Okay, so he's remembering a specific time when he saw Randal repairing a horseshoe for a very powerful horse. Okay, we see a lot of alliteration here. Powerful peers, bright and battering. We also see assonance in great grey dray horse. Okay, so remember, alliteration is the repetition of consonant sounds, and assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds. We see the A repeated. And these sound devices help to reinforce the image of strength that the speaker is trying to create of the younger Felix Randal. And then he goes on to say that he remembers him repairing a horseshoe, but he describes this horseshoe as a bright and battering sandal. And this metaphor compares a horseshoe to a sandal, which is the shoe of a Roman god. And this comparison suggests that Randal's skills were extremely impressive and made these horses stronger and more powerful. Okay, so if we look at the structure, it's an Italian sonnet. Right, so it's 14 lines broken up into an octave and sestet. The rhyme scheme is A, B, B, A, C, C, D, C, C, D. The volta is the point in which we see a change in subject matter. So our octave is very dispassionate and detached, dealing with the news of Randal's death, whereas the sestet expresses sorrow and this deep sense of loss and grief. The themes we see here are religion, especially through the fact that our speaker is the minister or the priest who counsels Felix Randal. We see how he uses religion to help Randal accept his illness, and also we see a theme of nature, the natural order of things, of life and death. Okay, so remember, if you found this video helpful, click like, subscribe, and don't forget to share. And check out the other videos on my channel.